alternative ways of composing music. There are some passages in Zappa's earlier music which are clearly written using, if not 12-tone method, then very chromatic compositional methods. Those sound like wrong note music, to use that unfortunate phrase, and they stick out very clearly in Zappa's tracks. There are also other moments where I think it would be fair to say it's almost as if there's pastiche Schoenberg being performed. Sometimes in the choral writing that one finds, for instance, on 200 Motels, or in the piano writing that one finds in some other tracks.
And just as Zappa was fascinated by the very singular path that Schoenberg had taken, he was also intrigued by the equally unique work of the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. Named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century, Stravinsky's response to Wagner's compositional challenge found a far larger audience than Schoenberg's, though it was no less daring or inspired.
The tradition that Stravinsky grew up in was very much that of Rimsky-Korsakov and earlier Russian composers. It was heavily indebted to Russian folklore. It was very colourful music. It made use of tonality, but in a variety that included a lot of chromaticisms of a colourful kind. And this really culminated in The Rite of Spring in 1912 and 1913, which is very much based in the traditions of Russian folklore, which makes use of a lot of traditional Russian melodies, although they're in many cases heavily disguised. This, in a sense, sets an agenda for a certain kind of post-tonal creation in which the interest is very much on the surface of the music in terms of its colour and its immediate sensation. It's also very rhythmic music, as one might expect coming out of the Russian tradition. Many of Stravinsky's earlier works were ballet scores, and inevitably in a ballet score, the idea of some kind of through-composed, long, arched musical argument has to fall by the wayside because the music has to focus very much on the individual scenas that make up the balletic story. Accordingly, even a work like The Rite of Spring is very much broken up into blocks of sound which are juxtaposed with each other. Stravinsky moves increasingly towards a sound world which, to a greater or lesser extent, draws on popular musical archetypes, but also, on the one hand, colours those with additional chromaticisms or dissonances and with additional tone colours, but also treats them in a very block-like way, so one gets almost in a cut-and-paste format, columns, fragments, blocks of music being juxtaposed against each other rather than being developed in the more traditional Austro-German way.
And just as Schoenberg's work had influenced Zappa's own writing, so too with Stravinsky's compositional methods.
The cut-and-paste block type of writing that Stravinsky developed during this period was enormously important to Zappa. One finds it on one level in single tracks, which seem to jump from musical idea to musical idea without any of the ideas particularly being developed, but rather being juxtaposed with each other. But one also finds it on some of the whole sides of an album, for instance, or in the very extended tracks, where it's almost as if small pieces are jostling for attention. I think it'd be fair to say in part one of Lumpy Gravy, this is exactly what happens, in that one gets a number of compositions which are cut up and pasted in with other musical items, as well as sound effects, extracts of conversation, and so on and so forth. The whole thing, in a sense, becomes a kind of collage or mosaic of different blocks of colour, sound, texture, and so on and so forth, rather than any kind of organic, long-term developed arch of ideas.
Zappa's interest in the composers of the 20th century led him to Schoenberg's key pupil, Webern, the electronic works and tape manipulations of Karlheinz Stockhausen and Pierre Schaeffer, and the pioneer of chance music, John Cage. Yet his greatest inspiration in this realm remained the first classical composer whose work he had discovered, the Frenchman Edgard Varèse. Another musical visionary, across a relatively small number of works composed both in France and in America, he redefined the role of timbre and rhythm in classical music. His magnum opus, Ionization, composed in the late 1920s, was a work written entirely for percussion, and towards the end of his life he embraced electronic music. On Zappa and the Mothers' debut, Freak Out, not only is Varèse's name amongst the list of influences, but his declaration that the present-day composer refuses to die is included by Zappa as a kind of war cry, a statement of intent that would also appear on several other Mothers releases throughout the 60s.
The quote, "the present-day composer refuses to die," is the first quote in a bunch of relevant quotes that you get on Freak Out, and it reappeared on a lot of the subsequent records. So the name Edgard Varèse, Zappa promoted probably above any other influence. That was the big one. And he was very attached to Edgard Varèse because he found him himself. No one told him that Edgard Varèse was good or great. He had an idea that really there was a conspiracy to hide this kind of music from him. He found it in the same way that he found a lot of R&B in a dusty record shop.
Varèse is a fascinating figure, both in his own right and in terms of the influence that he has on Zappa. If one took the standard view of 20th century music history as being the dichotomy of following either Schoenberg or Stravinsky, I think it's fair to say that Varèse really stood quite outside that dichotomy. His attitudes were mostly derived from a combination of the two composers, but also I think they came out of a Russian and especially a French attitudes towards sound as sound. Varèse liked to portray himself as a parentless orphan. Of course, one can't be born an orphan, and there are some clear examples in his earlier music of how he consciously borrows from Debussy and Stravinsky. But he very much tried to create the image of a composer who was forging ahead into completely new territory, whereas both Stravinsky and Schoenberg were moving forward with their eyes very much fixed on what had preceded them. It would seem that Varèse had no real conception of music history and was much more intent on discovering a musical future.